Let's start with the BOE. What's your reaction to the decision?
I think obviously there was not a lot of surprise around this decision. Slightly interesting that they've increased the growth forecast at the same time as highlighting increased uncertainty around Brexit. It is true that some people had been thinking that the net result of all of the back and forth around Brexit over the last few weeks and months was that possibly we were looking at a deal with Europe and what's more a kind of softish form of Brexit. So you might have expected them to say that the uncertainty was the same or even a bit better. But I think it's a reflection of reality that they are still faced with this big hole in their forecast, which is the first half of next year. They just don't know how that Brexit date's going to play out. And until we have that, there's got to be a question mark about everything else.
Well, fair point. And that raises the question, too. The narrative is a rate hike one and done, or are they actually on the road to normalization? Which camp do you feel like we're on now?
Again, it slightly depends on whether, how we see that Brexit date when Britain leaves the EU play out, how it affects the economy. We have seen the most recent news was that the economy had maintained momentum in the second half, that it was not being hugely affected or any further affected by the uncertainty around Brexit. We know, we have had a step down in growth because of that referendum decision, but it doesn't seem to be getting any worse, and the data's been a little bit better, and the wage growth is firming up. So they can't ignore that, and I think the market's forecasting at the moment is expecting that next rate hike in the spring of next year. They're not pushing back against that yet, but we are looking at a very, very slow path of tightening of maybe even just one rate rise a year, one small rate rise a year.
Yeah, Stephanie, as you suggest, Mr. Carney has a devilishly difficult job, given he doesn't know what's going on with Brexit. But actually, to mention one other thing that they've talked about, it's not just the problems with the uncertainty of Brexit. They also mention trade and emerging markets as things that they're not sure where those are going either.
Yeah, and that's the irony of the whole Brexit debate is actually the UK as a market is probably most exposed to global trade. It's a very open economy, very dependent on trade, and certainly the stock market is extremely dependent on the global trade, and particularly what's happening in emerging markets. Investors often think of the UK almost as an honorary emerging market because it moves much more closely with EM than many other developed countries. So that if the trade story is starting to affect the global momentum, and we're seeing it a little bit in people's forecasts now, then that's probably more important for the UK than some other European countries.